By sunrise in 1938, somewhere near the river bend outside Atka Crossing, Alaska, the sled dogs walked back through the snow in a calm line. Every harness empty, every breath steady. The lead husky, Karga, came back too, his paws barely making sound on the frozen trail, his body moving slow and deliberate through the white. But the man who set the gang line before dawn wasn't with them anymore, and the gang line itself was coiled neat on the snow where no boot prints stood at all. The leather straps of Karga's harness were still warm against air cold enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground, and the coil of line sat perfect and even, loops tight as if laid by a careful hand, though no hand had touched it and no tracks led to or from the spot where it rested. Atka Crossing sat at the edge of river ice country in Alaska, where the spruce pressed close and the aurora hissed low enough some nights that dogs would lift their heads and whine. It was a place of trap lines, frozen supply runs, and men who knew how to read wind on open white and knew when to turn back before the cold turned mean. The winters there were long and black, the kind that settled deep into bone and wood and made even the bravest men careful. The river bent sharp just past the village, curving into a stretch where the ice always looked darker than it should, thicker in some places and thin in others, and the aurora would hang low over that bend on clear nights, close enough that some swore they could hear it hiss like wet wood on a fire. People around Atka Crossing called it the Bend, and most didn't linger there after the light started to fail. It was the kind of place where you trust a man to run a sled solo before dawn, because that's just how the work gets done in Alaska. But after that morning in 1938, trust wasn't enough anymore. The musher's name was Elias Norvik. He was 31 years old, steady in his movements and known around Atka Crossing as the kind of man who didn't spook easy. His hands were thick from years of handling line and harness, and his voice carried calm, even when the dogs got wild or the weather turned. He'd grown up on sleds, learned to read ice before he could read words, and people trusted him the way they trust a good axe or a solid roof. His wife, Anna, kept a fire going in the cabin each night he was out on the line, and his two young daughters knew the sound of his sled bells before they could see him coming through the dark. They'd wait by the window, breath fogging the glass, listening for that soft jingle cutting through the cold. Elias ran the Riverbend route twice a week in winter, a supply drop to a trapper's cache 5 miles upriver, always before first light, always back by noon. He'd been running that route for 3 winters without trouble, without delay, without so much as a broken runner or a spooked dog. People in Alaska still remember that he never once came back late. Not until the morning he didn't come back at all. That morning, Anna woke to the sound of bells at the door. She stepped outside in her wool coat and thick boots and found the team standing calm in the snow, breath clouding soft and steady in the cold air. Karga stood at the front, head low, ears pinned flat against his skull. His eyes were wide and dark, and he wouldn't look at her. The gangline lay coiled on the ground behind him, loops even and tight, resting on snow that showed no prints, no marks, no sign that anyone had knelt or bent to lay it there. And the leather was still warm. Not cold, not stiff. Warm like it had just come off a man's body, like it had been held in hands only moments before. The sled was gone. Elias was gone. And the snow around the cabin showed no boot prints except Anna's own, pressed fresh and clear into the frost. She touched the gangline with one bare hand and pulled back fast. The warmth was wrong. It was the kind of wrong that sits heavy in the chest, the kind that makes a person's breath catch. She called out for Elias, her voice cutting sharp across the white, and the sound carried far in the still air but brought back nothing. No answer. No movement in the tree line. The dogs didn't move. Karga turned his head toward the river bend and whined once, low in his throat, a sound she'd never heard him make before, then sat down hard in the snow and refused to stand. She tried to coax him inside, tried to pull him by the harness, but he planted his paws and wouldn't budge. He just stared upriver, ears flat, body trembling, as if something out there had put a fear in him too deep to shake. Men in Alaska still won't sled that bend alone before sunrise. Not then. Not now. Anna called 2 neighbors within the hour. By mid-morning, 6 men were walking the river bend in a line, marking their path with strips of red cloth tied to willows every 10 paces. The air was still, and the sky sat low and gray over the spruce, pressing down like a lid. They found the sled a quarter-mile upriver, tipped on its side but undamaged, resting clean on fresh snow with no sign of how it got there. The supplies were still lashed tight. Flour sacks, dried fish, a tin of lamp oil, all in place, all untouched. Elias's gloves were tucked under the lash rope, fingers still holding their shape as if his hands had just slipped out of them, the leather still soft, still warm. But there were no boot prints near the sled, no sign of struggle, no blood on the ice or the wood, no drag marks in the snow, no broken branches, no torn fabric. Nothing at all to say a man had been there, except the gloves and the sled and the eerie stillness of the place. The kind of stillness that makes a man want to leave and not look back. One of the men, a trapper named Halverson, knelt by the sled and touched the gloves. "Still warm," he said, and pulled his hand back fast. The other men stared at him. The air temperature that morning was well below freezing, cold enough that metal stuck to skin, cold enough that breath turned to ice on a beard, cold enough that bare hands went numb in seconds. Warm gloves in that kind of cold made no sense at all. Halverson stood up and backed away from the sled, and none of the other men stepped closer. They brought the sled back to the cabin and left it outside near the woodpile. Anna stood on the porch with her daughters pressed close to her sides and watched the men search the tree line until the light began to fail. They walked shoulder to shoulder through the scrub willows, calling Elias's name, their voices flat and small in the cold air. But the only sound that came back was wind hissing through the spruce and the soft creak of ice settling on the river. By dusk, they'd marked every tree within a half-mile of the bend, and still there was nothing. No tracks, no sign, no answers. That night, Karga would not eat from the trail pot. He sat near the door and stared upriver, ears flat, body tight as wire. When Anna tried to bring him inside, he pulled away and circled the cabin 3 times, sniffing the snow where the gang line had been coiled, his nose low to the ground, his breath coming fast. Then he lay down in the cold outside the door and wouldn't move, even when she called his name, even when she brought him food and water. He just lay there staring at the bend, shaking. By the second night, the older sledders around Atka Crossing were already telling the younger ones, "You don't run that bend solo anymore. You don't answer if you hear bells out there after dark. And you don't look too long at the place where the river ice goes black, because some things in Alaska coil a line neater than any human hand ever could. And some things leave warmth where cold should be." The younger men listened, and most of them believed it, because they'd seen Karga's eyes and they'd touched that gang line themselves. Warm leather in frozen air is not something a man forgets. It's not something a man talks about easily either. But around Atka Crossing, people talked about it anyway, in low voices, in kitchens and cabins, because silence felt worse than words. 3 days after Elias vanished, Karga limped back to the cabin. He came at dusk, moving slow through the snow, favoring his right front paw, his head low and his tail tucked. Anna opened the door and he walked inside without lifting his head, went straight to the corner by the stove and lay down. His ears stayed pinned, his eyes stayed wide. And when Anna brought him food, warm broth, dried fish, strips of fat, he wouldn't eat. He just stared at the door, head low, body tense, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear. The men who came to check on Anna tried to calm the dog, tried to coax him with food and kind words, but Karga wouldn't take it. He only stared upriver toward the bend, his breath shallow and fast. And when the stove fire died in the early hours and the cabin went cold and dark, he stood up, walked to the door, and scratched once. Anna let him out. By gray light, he was gone again. This time, he didn't come back. People around Atka Crossing, Alaska, still say the river sometimes coils a line by itself. And they still tell the new sledders, the ones who come in from outside and don't know the stories yet. If your lead dog won't cross the bend, you don't make him. You turn back. You wait for daylight. You double your team. And you never, ever go looking for what made him afraid in the first place. Because some fears in Alaska are older than the ice, and some disappearances don't end with answers. Anna Norvik marked the hours in her head the way people do when waiting turns to dread. Elias had left the cabin at 4 in the morning. She'd heard the sled bells fade into the dark, heard the dog's paws crunching through snow, heard the silence after. By 6, the team was back without him. By 7, neighbors were walking the bend. By noon, they'd found the sled and the warm gloves and nothing else. By nightfall, every man within 5 miles of Atka Crossing knew something had gone wrong in a way that didn't fit any pattern they recognized. The timeline made no sense. Halverson, the trapper, had been checking his line that morning a mile east of the bend. He swore he heard sled bells at 4:30, faint but clear, moving upriver the way Elias always ran. Another man, a logger named Ostergaard, said he'd seen lantern light on the ice near the bend around the same time, a single steady glow moving north. But by 6, the dogs were already back at the cabin, calm and unharmed, and the gang line was coiled warm on the snow. That gave Elias less than 2 hours to vanish, leave his sled a quarter-mile upriver, abandon his gloves, and disappear without a single track in fresh snow. It didn't add up, and the warmth, the gang line, the gloves, the harness straps, made it worse because warmth meant recent, meant close, meant something had touched those things after Elias let go. They swear they heard his bells at 4:30, one of the neighbors said to Anna on the second day, standing in her doorway with his hat in his hands. But by 6, the team was already home with no rider, and nobody saw him cross back past the village. There's only one trail in and out of that bend, and we walked it twice. He didn't come back through. Anna didn't answer. She just looked past him toward the river, where the ice sat black and still under gray sky. The search began in earnest on the second morning. 12 men walked the bend in a line, shoulder to shoulder, marking their path with strips of red cloth tied to willow branches every 10 paces. They moved slow, calling Elias's name every few paces, their voices swallowed by the cold air and the thick silence of the spruce. The dogs they brought, 3 of the best tracking dogs in Atka Crossing, pulled hard for the first 100 yards, noses low to the snow, breath steaming in the cold. Then they stopped dead at the edge of the bend where the ice turned dark. All 3 dogs planted their paws at the exact same spot, whined low in their throats, and refused to go farther. The men tried pulling them, tried coaxing them with food, tried dragging them forward by their leads. The dogs just sat down in the snow, ears flat, tails tucked, bodies trembling, and wouldn't budge. "Never seen them do that," one of the handlers said, kneeling beside his dog and running a hand over its trembling back. "Not for ice, not for wolves, not for anything. This one tracked a bear through a blizzard last winter and didn't flinch. Now look at him." The dog was shaking so hard its legs were barely holding it up. The handler stood and backed away, pulling the dog with him. The other 2 dogs were the same, trembling, whining, eyes wide, and fixed on something the men couldn't see. The handlers gave up and took the dogs back to the village, and the men walked the bend without them. They checked every tree, every depression in the snow, every shadow under the spruce. They dragged hooks through the shallow water at the river's edge where the ice was thin and dark and cracked under pressure. They pried up sections of snow crust with shovels to check for blood, for fabric, for anything. They found nothing. No boot prints, no broken branches, no torn cloth, no sign of a struggle, just snow and ice and the red cloth markers fluttering in the wind. And the feeling, every man felt it, though none said it out loud, that something was watching them from the tree line. A few of the men claimed they heard movement in the spruce, branches snapping, snow falling in soft thuds, but when they turned to look, there was nothing there. Just trees and shadow, and the cold pressing in. By the 3rd day, Anna had stopped sleeping. She sat by the window with a blanket around her shoulders and watched the bend, waiting for movement, waiting for Elias to walk out of the white the way he always did, steady and calm and unshaken. But the white stayed empty. The daughters slept in shifts, curled together on the narrow bed, and Anna kept the fire burning all night, feeding it wood she didn't have to spare, because the cold felt worse than usual that winter, sharper, meaner, like it was pressing in from all sides. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and fear, and the silence between Anna and her daughters was heavy and unbroken, except for the crackle of the fire and the soft sound of wind against the walls. On the 4th morning, something changed. One of the searchers, a young man named Torstein, was checking the willows near the sled site when he noticed a strip of red cloth tied to a branch he was certain they hadn't marked. He called the others over. The cloth was fresh, bright, tied in the same knot they used for markers, a simple overhand loop pulled tight. But none of them remembered tying it to that particular branch. Halverson walked over and touched the cloth. It was dry, clean, no frost on it, no snow clinging to the fibers. He looked at the other men. Who tied this one? Nobody answered. Nobody claimed it. And when they counted the markers they'd brought, none were missing. Maybe one of us forgot, Torstein said, but his voice was thin, uncertain. Maybe, Halverson said. But he didn't believe it, and neither did anyone else. They stood there in the cold, staring at the red cloth, and nobody moved to untie it or take it down. After a moment, they walked on, marking their path with new strips, and the strange marker stayed where it was, fluttering alone in the wind. That afternoon, they heard a sound. It came from upriver, past the bend, a soft two-note whistle cutting through the still air. The kind of whistle Elias used to call the dogs in from a long line. The men froze. The whistle came again, faint but clear, and this time it seemed to come from a different direction, farther south, closer to the cabin. Halverson cupped his hands and shouted Elias's name, his voice echoing flat across the snow. The echo came back dead and empty. The whistle didn't come again, but every man there heard it and every man knew what it was supposed to mean, and none of them could explain why it came from two places at once, or why it sounded so much like Elias and yet felt wrong in a way they couldn't name. The older hands around Atka crossing Alaska began pulling the younger men aside that week and telling them in low voices, "You don't check that line alone anymore. You don't go near the bend without a partner. You don't answer if you hear a whistle out there, even if it sounds like someone you know, because sound travels strange on the ice, and not everything that calls is looking to be found." The younger men listened, some skeptical, some silent, but all of them uneasy, because the dogs wouldn't cross the bend and the whistle had come from two directions, and the red cloth marker had appeared where no one remembered tying it. By the end of the first week, the search parties were smaller. Men still walked the bend, but they did it in pairs now and they didn't stay past noon. The snow had covered most of the tracks, and the red cloth markers hung limp and faded on the willows, and the cold had settled deep enough that standing still for more than a few minutes meant risking frostbite. Anna kept the fire burning, kept the window clear, kept waiting. And Karga, who had limped back to the cabin on the third day, eaten nothing and left again in the gray light of morning, did not return. On the 9th day, one of the searchers found something. It was Ostergaard, the logger, checking a section of tree line they'd already walked twice before. He saw a shape in the snow near the base of a spruce, a small pile of leather and metal, neatly arranged. He knelt and brushed the snow away. It was a second harness, not Karga's harness. That one was still hanging in Anna's cabin, the straps still faintly warm when she'd first touched them. This was a different harness, identical in every detail, clean and dry, and laid out as if someone had just unbuckled it and set it down with care. The buckles gleamed dull in the gray light. The leather smelled faintly of oil and dog and cold air. Ostergaard picked it up. The leather was still warm. He stood there holding it, breath coming fast, and looked around. No tracks, no sign of who had left it or when. He carried it back to the cabin without a word and set it on Anna's porch. She came to the door and looked at it, then looked at him. "Where's the first one?" she asked. "Still inside," he said, "hanging by the stove where you left it." Anna walked inside and checked. The first harness was still there, untouched, hanging on its peg near the stove. She came back to the porch and stared at the second one. 2 harnesses, both warm, both identical, and no explanation for how the second one got there, or why it had been laid out so carefully in the snow, or what it meant that someone, or something, had gone to the trouble of placing it where it would be found. The men in Alaska stopped talking about finding Elias after that. They started talking about staying away from the bend, about keeping the children close, about not running sleds solo before dawn, and in the back of every conversation, unspoken but understood, was the question nobody wanted to ask out loud. If the harness came back twice, what else might come back, and when, and in what shape? By the second week, the search had become a ritual. Men walked the bend every morning, not because they expected to find Elias anymore, but because stopping felt like giving up. And giving up felt like admitting something they couldn't name. They walked in pairs, always in daylight, always marking their path with fresh cloth strips tied to the willows. They dragged hooks through the shallows where the ice was thin. They checked the tree line. They called his name, though the calls had grown quieter, more hesitant, as if they were afraid of what might answer back. Anna kept a grid on paper, marking each section of the bend they'd searched, crossing off squares in pencil as the men reported back each evening. The grid grew darker, more complete, until almost every square was marked. But Elias stayed gone, and the warmth on the gang line and the gloves and the second harness stayed unexplained, and the questions piled up in the spaces between words where nobody wanted to look too closely. On the 13th day, a young sledder named Henrik was checking the sled site, the place where they'd found Elias's sled tipped on its side with the supplies still lashed tight, when he noticed something wedged between two spruce roots near the snow. He knelt and pulled it free. It was a piece of paper folded once, the edges clean and sharp as if it had just been cut. He unfolded it carefully. The paper was dry, unstained by snow or moisture, and on it, in ink that looked fresh and black, were 4 words written in a hand he recognized immediately. "Check the north cache." Henrik stood up fast, the paper trembling in his gloved hand. He knew that handwriting. Everyone in Atka Crossing knew it. It was Elias's handwriting, the same slanted script he used in the supply ledgers, the same careful loops he made when he wrote notes to Anna or marked his trapline maps. Henrik had seen it 100 times. There was no mistaking it. But Elias had been gone for 13 days, and this paper was clean and dry, and tucked between roots in a spot they'd walked past at least a dozen times before without seeing anything. He brought the note to Halvorsen, who was standing near the sled with 2 other men. Halvorsen took the note and stared at it for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at Henrik. "Where'd you find this?" "Between the roots. Right there." Henrik pointed. Halvorsen walked over and checked the spot. No tracks. No disturbance in the snow. Just the roots and the place where the note had been wedged, clean and deliberate, as if someone had placed it there knowing it would be found. He looked at the note again, held it up to the light. The ink was dark and even, not smudged, not faded, fresh. He folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket. "We checked the north cache," he said. "All of us. Right now." The north cache was a supply shelter 2 miles upriver, built into the side of a low ridge where trappers stored food and gear during the winter runs. Elias had mentioned it in passing a few times, but he rarely used it. His usual route didn't go that far. The men walked there in a tight group, nobody speaking, breath clouding in the cold air. The snow underfoot was hard-packed, and the spruce stood silent on either side of the trail, their branches heavy with frost. When they reached the cache, they found the door unlatched, swinging slightly in the wind. Halvorsen pushed it open. Inside, the shelves were stocked the way they always were: dried fish, flour sacks, lamp oil, rope. But on the small wooden table in the center of the room, laid out neat and deliberate, was Elias's leather satchel. Nobody had mentioned the satchel before. Nobody had thought to look for it, but there it was. The same satchel Elias carried on every supply run, the one he kept tied to the sled handle. Anna had described it to the search party on the second day. Brown leather, worn at the corners, a brass buckle that stuck sometimes. This was it, and it was sitting on the table, buckle fastened, as if someone had just set it down and walked away. Halvorsen opened the satchel slowly. Inside were Elias's things: a small notebook, a pencil, a tin of tobacco, a folding knife with a bone handle. Nothing missing, nothing disturbed. And underneath it all, folded at the bottom of the satchel, was a second note. Halvorsen pulled it out and unfolded it. The handwriting was the same, the ink was fresh, and the note said only, "I came back for it." The men stood in the cache and stared at the note. Nobody touched the satchel. Nobody moved. Outside, the wind hissed through the spruce and the light was starting to fail. Henrik broke the silence first. "He never came up here," he said, his voice tight. "This wasn't his route. He never used the North Cache." "I know," Halverson said. "Then how does Satchel get here?" Halverson didn't answer. He folded the note and put it in his pocket with the first one, then closed the satchel and left it on the table. They walked back to Atka Crossing in silence, and when they told Anna what they'd found, she sat down on the porch steps and didn't speak for a long time. Finally she said, "That's his hand. I'd know it anywhere." "I know," Halverson said, "but he's been gone for 13 days. "I know." Anna looked at him, then looked away. "What does it mean?" Halverson had no answer for that. None of them did. Some in Atka Crossing said Elias had enemies. Men he'd slighted in trade, debts unpaid, old grudges from his younger years. Others said the land out past the thorn fence and the dark ice never gives back what it takes, that the Bend had claimed men before and would claim them again, that the river itself had a hunger no one understood. A few whispered it wasn't a man at all that brought the team home, that something had taken Elias's place on the sled just long enough to coil the gangline neat and leave the harness warm, and that the notes were not comfort, but warning, left by something that could mimic a man's hand but not his soul. Nobody said the word ghost, nobody said spirit, but the fear was there, low and constant, in the way people checked over their shoulders when they walked past the Bend, in the way they kept their children inside after dark, in the way they stopped talking when the wind picked up and the aurora hissed low over the river. The Bend became a place people named but didn't point at, a place marked on maps, but avoided in practice, a scar on the land that everyone knew but nobody wanted to acknowledge. After that week, nobody in Alaska took that route alone before dawn. Not then, not now. The rule became law without ever being spoken, passed from the older sledders to the younger ones in quiet conversations by the fire or during supply runs. You don't go near the Bend solo. You don't check the North Cache unless there's 2 of you, and you don't stay past noon. You don't answer if you hear a whistle or a call, even if it sounds like someone you know, because sound out there doesn't always come from where it should. And if you find something that shouldn't be there, a marker, a note, a harness laid out clean on the snow, you leave it where it is and you walk away. The 2 notes stayed in Halverson's coat pocket for a week before he finally brought them to Anna. She read them both, tracing the letters with one finger, her face blank and still. Then she folded them carefully and put them in a tin box with Elias's other papers, his trapline maps, his supply lists, a letter he'd written to his mother years before and never sent. She didn't cry. She didn't ask questions. She just closed the box and put it on the high shelf where the children couldn't reach, and she never opened it again. The satchel stayed on the table in the North Cache for another month before someone finally moved it. By then the leather had gone cold, and the smell of tobacco had faded, and the cache felt different, emptier, heavier, like something had left but the shape of it remained. The man who moved the satchel, a trapper named Anderson, said later that the buckle was warm when he touched it, even though the air inside the cache was below freezing and the stove hadn't been lit in weeks. He carried the satchel back to Anna without opening it, and she took it without a word and hung it on a peg by the door. And it stayed there for years, untouched, a reminder of something nobody wanted to remember, but nobody could forget. People around Atka Crossing, Alaska stopped walking the Bend alone after that winter. The rule became part of the landscape, as fixed and unchangeable as the river itself. And when new sledders came through, drawn by work or desperation or the promise of good trapping, the older hands would pull them aside and tell them in low voices, "You don't run that route solo. You don't check the North Cache after dark. And if you see a note in handwriting you recognize from a man who's been gone for years, you leave it where it lies, and you don't look back." The weeks became months, and the months became years. But the Bend outside Atka Crossing, Alaska, never stopped being a place people avoided. The red cloth markers rotted off the willows and were not replaced. The sled trail grew over with scrub and new snow, and eventually the route was marked on maps with a notation that simply read, "Alternate recommended." Nobody wrote down why. Nobody needed to. Anna Norvik stayed in the cabin with her daughters for 2 more winters, keeping the fire burning and the satchel hanging by the door. The tin box on the high shelf stayed closed. She never spoke Elias's name out loud after the first year, but the girls knew not to ask and the neighbors knew not to press. In the 3rd spring after Elias disappeared, Anna sold the cabin and the remaining sled team and moved south to Anchorage, where the winters were shorter and the rivers didn't bend in ways that made people nervous. She took the tin box with her, and the satchel, and she never came back to Atka Crossing. The cabin sat empty for a decade before a logging company bought the land and tore it down. The foundation stones are still there, half buried in moss and snow, and people around Atka Crossing still won't camp on that spot, even now. Karga never came back. Some say he froze on the ice. Others say he found his way to another mushers team farther north and lived out his years in harness, never recognizing his name when it was called. A few, the ones who were there that winter, who saw his eyes and felt the warmth on the gang line, say he's still out there, limping slow through the white, listening for something only he can hear. Every few years, someone claims to have seen a lone husky near the bend, moving slow and deliberate, ears pinned flat, refusing to come when called. The sightings are never confirmed, but they're never dismissed either. The gang line itself disappeared sometime in the first month. Anna had coiled it and left it on the porch, and one morning it was gone. No tracks, no sign it had been moved. Just the empty spot where it had been, the wood underneath still warm to the touch. Nobody went looking for it. And when Henrik, the young sledder who'd found the first note, suggested organizing a search, Halvorsen pulled him aside and said quietly, "Some things leave on their own. Let it go." Henrik listened. They all did. By 1945, the story of Elias Norvik had become part of the landscape in Alaska. New sledders heard it on their first week, usually from an older man who'd pull them aside after a run and say, in a voice that didn't invite questions, "You don't take the bend alone, you don't check the North Cache solo. And if you hear a whistle out there that sounds like someone you know, you keep moving." The younger sledders listened, and most believed it, because the older men who told the story had the kind of faces that didn't lie about fear. The story was told the same way every time. The warm gang line, the notes in Elias's handwriting, the satchel in the cache he never used. And the rules that followed were absolute. 2 men, never one. Daylight only. No exceptions. The North Cache was eventually abandoned. The doors stayed unlatched, swinging in the wind, and nobody bothered to fix it. Supplies were moved to a new shelter 3 miles west, farther from the bend, and the old cache became a place people mentioned only to warn others away. In 1950, a trapper passing through stopped at the cache to get out of a storm. He said later that when he stepped inside, the table was empty except for a single leather strap, the kind used in dog harnesses, laid out neat and straight, buckle gleaming. The air inside was colder than it should have been, and the silence felt heavy, oppressive, like something was waiting just out of sight. He didn't touch the strap. He didn't stay. He walked 3 miles through a blizzard rather than spend the night in that cache, and when people asked him why, he just said, "Something in there doesn't want company." The strap was gone the next time someone checked. The table was bare, but the story stayed, and the cache stayed empty. And eventually the roof caved in under snow and the walls leaned inward, and the whole structure became just another ruin in the Alaska wilderness, marked on old maps and forgotten by new ones. Parents around Atka Crossing still tell their children not to wander near the bend, even in daylight, even in summer when the ice is gone and the river runs fast and clear. They don't explain why. They just say, "Stay close to the village," and the children listen because the tone is the kind that doesn't allow argument. Schools adjusted their schedules decades ago so that no child has to walk the old sled trail alone before sunrise or after dusk, and new families moving into the area are quietly told which routes are safe and which are not, though the reasons are left vague and unspoken. The bend is just a place you don't go. That's all. And in Alaska, where the land is vast and unforgiving, people have learned not to question those kinds of rules. In 1960, a state surveyor working on a new road project found a piece of paper wedged under a rock near the bend. The paper was dry and clean, the ink still dark, and the handwriting was neat and slanted. The note said only, "Turn back." The surveyor showed it to his supervisor, who showed it to the local foreman, who quietly rerouted the road 2 miles south without explanation. The road still runs that way today, a long curve that adds 15 minutes to the drive but keeps traffic away from the bend. Nobody questions it. The detour is just part of the map now, as fixed as the river. And when new engineers propose straightening the road to save time and money, the older locals quietly shut down the idea without giving reasons. Some things, they say, are better left the way they are. Over the years, other things appeared and disappeared near the bend. A second gang line coiled neat on a stump. A pair of gloves, warm and dry, resting on snow in a place no one had walked. A sled runner, clean and undamaged, leaning against a tree where no sled had been. A folded note with no words, just a single line drawn in fresh ink. Each time the object was left alone, and each time it vanished within days, gone without explanation. People stopped reporting these findings after a while. They just noted them quietly among themselves and moved on, because talking about them felt like inviting something in that was better left outside. The 2 notes Halverson gave to Anna, "Check the north cache, and I came back for it," stayed in the tin box on the high shelf until Anna's death in 1978. Her daughters, grown by then with families of their own, went through her things and found the box. They read the notes, stared at the handwriting they barely remembered, and without discussing it, burned both notes in the fireplace. Neither of them explained why. They just said later that it felt like the right thing to do, like closing a door that had been left open too long. When asked if they remembered their father, the older daughter said only, "We remember the rules he left behind." People around Atka Crossing, Alaska, still talk about Elias Norvik, though most who tell the story now never met him. They talk about the warm gang line and the notes in his handwriting and the satchel that appeared in a cache he never used. They talk about Karga, the lead husky who came back afraid and left again and never returned. And they talk about the rules. Never sled the bend alone, never check the north cache solo, never answer a whistle you hear in the white. Rules that have been followed for so long they've become part of the culture, woven into the landscape like the spruce and the ice and the river itself. Some say Elias had enemies and met a human end, that the notes were forged and the warmth was imagined, and the whole thing was a tragedy, twisted by fear and cold into something stranger than it was. Some say the ice took him, that he fell through a weak spot and the river carried him away, and that everything else, the warmth, the notes, the satchel, was coincidence or imagination, or the result of shock and cold playing tricks on desperate minds. But others, the ones who were there that winter, the ones who touched the warm leather and read the fresh ink and heard the 2-note whistle coming from 2 places at once, say it was something else entirely. They say the bend outside Atka Crossing doesn't follow the rules the rest of Alaska follows. That time moves different there. That something in that stretch of river knows how to coil a line and write a note and leave warmth where cold should be. They don't say what that something is. They don't use words like ghost or spirit. They just say the river takes care of its own, and leave it at that. Which version makes sense here? The human one, the natural one, or the impossible one nobody in Alaska dares to say out loud? What detail in this story should not exist in a normal world? The gang line still warm in freezing air, the notes in Elias's handwriting appearing days after he vanished, the satchel in a cache he never used, or the second harness laid out clean where no tracks led? And why, after all these years, do people in Alaska still follow rules born from a single winter morning when a man disappeared and his dogs came home without him? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.